Welcome back to NationCast Now, your trusted source for real news, deep analysis, and stories that shape our world. Before we begin, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to NationCast Now for the latest political, societal, and world events updates. All right, let's get started. Across the United States, a powerful message has taken over the streets, the screens, and the headlines are no kings. It's more than a slogan. It's a movement, a reminder of what America was built on, and what many people believe it's drifting away from. Over the past few months, thousands, even millions of Americans have come together in what's being called the largest coordinated protest since the early 2020s. They marched peacefully in cities across all 50 states: New York, Washington, D.C., Atlanta, Chicago, Los Angeles, Dallas, Seattle, holding signs that said, "We serve the Constitution, not a king." But what exactly is the No Kings protest, and why is it happening now? Why has it become a national movement, uniting people from so many different backgrounds? And what does it really mean for America's democracy and for President Donald Trump's legacy? Let's break it down step by step. The phrase "No Kings" goes back to the very beginning of the American experiment. The founders of the United States rejected the idea of monarchy, of one man holding absolute power, when they declared independence in 1776. They built a system designed to prevent that, a government of checks and balances, where no single branch and no single person could ever stand above the law. That's the heart of what these protests are about. According to organizers, the No Kings movement it's a pro-democracy campaign. They say it's about protecting the principle that every leader, whether it's Donald Trump or anyone else, must remain accountable to the law, to the people, and to the Constitution. The timing of the protests isn't random. They began shortly after statements made by President Trump regarding presidential power and legal immunity. In several interviews and social posts, Trump suggested that actions taken by a president in office should not be subject to prosecution, a position that many Americans saw as dangerous and potentially unconstitutional. That comment struck a nerve. To his supporters, Trump was simply emphasizing executive independence, arguing that presidents shouldn't be paralyzed by constant legal threat. But to many others, that sounded like a step too far. It raised an old question with new urgency. Can any leader be above the law? That question ignited a wave of activism. Within days, online forums, advocacy groups, and civic organizations began calling for peaceful nationwide demonstrations. By the time the movement officially launched, the turnout was staggering. Reports estimate over 7 million people participated across more than 2,700 locations in the U.S. Crowds filled major landmarks: the National Mall, Times Square, and the Golden Gate Bridge, carrying American flags, candles, and handmade posters with words like "Democracy means limits" and "Power belongs to the people." It was a rare moment, a protest that didn't center on a single law or policy, but on a core American value: accountability. So what do these protesters actually want? In interviews and public statements, organizers laid out three main goals. First, transparency and limits on executive power. They want Congress and the courts to reassert the balance that defines American democracy, ensuring that no president, current or future, can override the system of checks and balances. Second, protection of democratic norms. Many protesters say they're not just reacting to one president, but to a broader trend, a sense that politics has become more about personalities than principles. They worry that political loyalty has replaced institutional respect. Third, public engagement. They want Americans to wake up, to remember that democracy isn't automatic. It has to be defended, not just in voting booths, but in daily civic life. But why now? Why has this message, "No Kings," gained so much traction in 2025? Part of it has to do with the timing. The protest coincided with a military parade in Washington, D.C., celebrating the 250th anniversary of the U.S. Army, which also happened to fall on President Trump's birthday. The symbolism wasn't lost on anyone. As the parade celebrated American power, millions of demonstrators gathered to question how that power was being used. For many, the image of a president emphasizing loyalty and authority on the same day citizens marched for accountability was the perfect visual contrast to sides of America's ongoing debate over leadership and liberty. From a political analyst's perspective, the No Kings movement represents something rare, a spontaneous, large-scale expression of civic concern that cuts across traditional partisan lines. While a majority of protesters identify as left-leaning, the crowd also included conservatives, independents, veterans, and libertarians. People who disagree on almost everything else found common ground on one: belief the president should never be untouchable. Political scientist Dr. Andrea Morales called it a modern expression of the same principle that sparked the American Revolution. She said, "This is not anti-Trump as much as it is anti-monarchy. People are saying, we fought a war to get rid of kings. We're not bringing one back." Still, not everyone sees it that way. Trump's supporters argue that the protests are politically motivated, a coordinated effort to discredit him ahead of the next election cycle. They say the movement is fueled by media exaggeration and that his comments on immunity were misunderstood. According to them, Trump was defending the office of the presidency, not claiming personal privilege, and that's what makes the No Kings debate so complex. Both sides believe they're defending democracy, just in different ways. Trump's allies say a strong executive is necessary to make government effective and decisive. His critics say unchecked power threatens the very foundation of the republic. But let's look at the bigger picture. How is this affecting ordinary Americans? For many people, this protest has been a wake-up call. It reminded them that democracy democracy isn't just something happening in Washington. It's something each citizen shapes through participation, awareness, and accountability. Civic organizations report a surge in volunteer signups and voter registration drives. Universities have held open forums on presidential power and the Constitution. High schools are even using the No Kings protest as a teaching example in civics classes. In other words, whether you agree with the movement or not, it's sparking civic education, and that's powerful. Now let's talk about tone. Unlike some past demonstrations, the No Kings protests were overwhelmingly peaceful. Police in major cities like Washington, D.C., Chicago, and San Diego reported 0 arrests connected to the core events. Families marched with children, veterans carried flags, clergy led moments of silence. The images, candlelight vigils, signs quoting the Constitution gave the protests a unifying and patriotic feel. Of course, not every moment was perfect. There were a few isolated incidents, including a hit and run in California and an armed confrontation in South Carolina, but authorities quickly confirmed these were unrelated individuals, not protest organizers. Overall, the movement's discipline and tone stood out. It was civic, peaceful, and deeply symbolic, an example of what nonviolent protest can look like in the digital age. Now let's discuss the impact. First, the political impact. Lawmakers on both sides of the aisle have taken notice. Some Democrats have proposed new legislation clarifying limits on executive power, while a few Republicans have called for greater transparency in presidential actions. In short, the protest has reignited a debate about how much authority the U.S. president should have. Second, the cultural impact. The phrase "No Kings" has become a social media symbol, showing up in art, music, and online discussions. It's trending on platforms like X and TikTok, often paired with historical quotes about freedom and equality. And third, the psychological impact. After years of political fatigue and polarization, the protests have reminded people that collective action still matters, that public expression can be powerful even in divided times. Still, there are important challenges ahead. Experts warn that large protests can lose momentum if they don't evolve into sustained political engagement. The real test for No Kings will be whether this energy translates into policy change, or whether it fades into a memory. To succeed long-term, the movement must stay focused on principles, not personalities. If it becomes purely anti-Trump, it risks alienating moderate supporters and losing its civic identity. But if it keeps its message on democracy, law, and accountability, it could leave a lasting mark on American political culture. And where does this leave Donald Trump?